Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. My name is Catherine Goodman, and I'm the scientific editor at the Journal of Biological Chemistry, published by the ASBMB. Thanks for coming today. The ASBMB is a nonprofit scientific and educational organization with over 12,000 members worldwide. Founded in 1906, the Society is dedicated to serving scientists, whether through providing relevant scientific news like the coronavirus content shown here, or educational programs, grant writing resources, career resources, and much more. JBC published its first paper in 1905, and so has a 115-year tradition of science excellence. That tradition may include things you're already aware of, like our editor's picks, papers, and JBC reviews, some of which are depicted here in recent cover art, as well as things that happen behind the scenes, like the work of our image analysis team that you'll hear about from one of our speakers today. At JBC, we are passionate about making sure that the results and conclusions we're publishing will stand the test of time. And today's webinar is all about helping you make sure your data will stand the test of time as well. Before I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping notes. First, if you're having difficulty connecting to the webinar audio through your computer, you can call the number in the chat box. Please note, whether you connect through your computer or phone, all attendees will be muted for the duration of the webinar. However, this will still be an interactive webinar. During the presentation, you'll be prompted to participate in a few polls. Please be sure to answer the questions right away so we can discuss the answers. After the presentations, we'll have a Q&A session. We will answer as many questions as we can in the time we have, including both those that you submitted when you registered for the webinar, as well as those you submit at any point using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Next, to make sure we're all on the same page, I wanted to share a basic definition of a data management plan. As you can see, a data management plan is simple in concept, a plan for how you will manage your data, considering aspects like the data itself, how it's annotated and stored, and how and by whom it's maintained in the long term. These plans are all about small investments that will save days or weeks of time later, or possibly even prevent a paper getting retracted. However, the design and execution of these plans, getting buy-in from all of the relevant people involved, and sticking with it even when it seems like there are more important things to do is really the challenge. Our four speakers today are going to take you on a tour through these different aspects, each from a different perspective. Kaoru Sakabe will explore journal policies and expectations. Berndsen and Ulens will share their strategies and motivations for good data management in the short and long term. And Jennifer Reiswig will explain how your institution can help you from the librarian's perspective. To help get you in the mood for Kaoru's presentation, here is our first poll. How long would it take you to locate the original data for your first paper? So choose whichever is most appropriate for you. I'm on the edge of my seat, waiting to see what you'll pick. Okay, so it looks like a lot of you guys are pretty organized. I'm excited to see how you'll take in this presentation. Now let's hear from Kaoru about what the JBC data show. Over to you, Kaoru.
Hello, thank you all for attending this webinar today. My name is Kaoru Sakabe, and I'm the Data Integrity Manager for ASBMB. So the real meat and potatoes of this webinar are the presentations following mine. So I'm only going to spend a few minutes talking to you about the journal perspective on data management. Because really, by the time you get to submitting and publishing your paper, it's going to be far too late to discover that your data management plan isn't adequate. In fact, we wanted to test this question with our authors at JBC. How long would it take authors to produce the original data for manuscripts still under review? Basically, we would shoot an email to the authors requesting data, and then we tracked how long it took them to send it. So we did this for about 6 months. These numbers are not adjusted to account for any time differences or weekends. I'd say for the most part, our authors did pretty well in that they were able to provide data within 0 to 3 days. But you can see from our graph, we did have several stragglers who took a bit longer to provide data, and even a few who were unable to provide it at all. This is particularly concerning when the manuscript is still under review and not even published. Imagine if a reader asked the authors to share some cool data after publication. Would they even be able to find it? So the most common responses we heard for delays in providing data were that the person who performed the experiment was on holiday or they had already left the lab. Another concerning thing we noticed is that we sometimes had to make multiple requests for the same data. For example, we'd ask to review the blots that were used in a certain figure panel, but the authors would provide different ones. Oftentimes, they didn't even notice that different images were provided. So the next question you may be asking yourself is, why would a journal even need to request data? Well, there are a variety of reasons. If your manuscript is under review, the reviewers may have asked to look at the raw data. If you've submitted your manuscript to a journal that does image analysis before accepting papers like JBC or JLR, the journal may request to review original data because they have questions regarding a figure. Finally, once the paper is published, the journal may receive a complaint about a figure, and they may need to contact the author to provide original data to clarify. But what exactly does the journal consider original data? Well, take for example this hypothetical figure panel. If this panel came to us in image analysis, we would ask the authors for the original data because these images have been over-adjusted. Oftentimes when we ask authors for original data, we are sent the exact same image that's in the figure panel, which is not helpful for us. Ideally, we want to see the full scans of the blots that have not been adjusted at all. This will help us determine if the image that's presented in the figure accurately represents the original data that were captured. Not only is this helpful for us, this is also helpful for you. Now, 1 week after you develop the blot, you will probably remember these lower molecular weight bands in the data on the right. But will you remember this in 1 month or even a year from now? What if a reviewer asks for data on the specificity of the antibody you used? The images on the left are not going to be useful. So just to summarize, these are some recommended best practices from the journal's perspective when you're putting your data together for a manuscript. Keep all the underlying data. If you have images, make sure you have retained one copy that hasn't been cropped or altered. If you do need to crop it or adjust it, make sure it's been saved as a different file. Also, I recommend you record what alterations were done to any final image. If you're using an imaging system, also make sure you're saving the native files for that system. Keep all the replicate data that went into the manuscript. I would save them in a way that you know which data are shown in the manuscript and which are the replicate data. For example, you could put them in separate folders labeled figure data, replicate 1, replicate 2, etc. Save any analyses that you did. Make sure it's not just that summary statistics graph, but also the raw numbers that went into that Excel or Prism file. Finally, I highly recommend adding a README document so that the files you saved are understandable to anybody who accesses it in the future, even you. Besides retaining the data that went into your manuscript, these data should also be shared with all your co-authors. First, if your co-authors are allowed to review the raw data, they may spot an error that was overlooked. It may also speed up any compliance checks with the journal if you're off on holiday. It's also best practices ethically. If co-authors are going to assume equal accountability for all parts of the work, then they should be able to review the raw data that went into it. So I just want to close with these 2 tweets. Although they're referring to metadata, I think it also applies to data management. The first one from Karen Cranston says, "You mostly collaborate with yourself, and me from 2 months ago never responds to email." And the second one from Jason Scott says, "Metadata or good data management is a love note to the future." And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and turn it back over to Catherine.
Great. So now we've heard about how things really happen at the JBC, and it's time for poll number 2. So in this case, let's say you've heard from Kaoru or a collaborator or someone that you need to pull up some of your old data. What are the challenges that you've encountered in these cases? And you can pick all of the answers that apply in this case. Okay, the results are coming in. All right, so it looks like a pretty wide range of things that cause you guys problems. And fortunately for Chris, it looks like one of the heavy hitters is there's not enough metadata with your data to understand what it was about. So let's hear from Chris Berndsen about how to set up systems that will prevent some of the problems you all are facing.
All right, thank you, Catherine. I appreciate the opportunity to present here and talk about some of the practices I found in setting up my lab and also doing a lot of data management with my students. I collaborate on projects with as many as 100 students at a time. And so managing data and keeping track of all of those different files that they produce can be pretty difficult. So let's talk about data and the production of it. We have some input data that we get from an experiment, whether it's a mass spec or some diffraction data or something else we use as an input, and then we do things with it, making charts, analyzing it to build models or write scripts or train or whatever. And in the end, we get some sort of output from these data, which hopefully results in a publication in the ideal sense. But the output data can be useful in the future and is something that you want to go forward with, but also others may want to use. I have a structural biology background, and I use the PDB and the small angle X-ray scattering database, and then use those to store my data. If they show up on the next slide here. But those are not the only databases that are useful. GenBank is another good example. The nice thing about these is that they take your output data and they store them in a consistent, accessible format, which makes it easy to share. And in many cases, journals require these numbers and accessibility for publication. Now, why can't we do that with all of our data, and including data that might be the intermediate or even the input data? That is the challenge for many of us. So if we go on to the next slide, when you're planning out your experiment and thinking about what you want to do, part of the research plan should be considering how you want to manage your data and use your data. So if we look at the different components you'd want to think about, the first question is, how do I want to sort or store or share the data? What am I going to do with my data? And this includes what types of files are you generating? How are you going to store them? Where are you going to store them and organize them? If you're going to collaborate, and you might be collaborating with people in different time zones or in different countries, how are you going to handle working asynchronously? If you've got a file that gets saved over and you're in a different time zone, you may not see that happen. So you want to make sure that you're managing the data in a way that you can see everything that's happening to it and how it's changing. And then when you do go for publication or making your data part of the public world, how are you going to disseminate it? How are you going to make it accessible? And I don't mean just on the internet. I mean, how are you going to make it so that someone who is not familiar with your data and your experiments and your approach can walk into your data set and find the information that they're interested in finding? And how available is it going to be for those who use it? So as we start moving forward, really, as it's been mentioned, your data are a note to you, and saying, I'm going to take my management plan and write a note to myself, so when I look back at it 2, 3, 4 months, 4 years, 10 years down the road, you know about the data you collected today. And so effective data management is really helping your future self analyze your data and you make good use of it, but also helping others look at your data and use it in the future. So and this is a daunting task. Certainly when I started out as a professor, I was able to pull some things together, but really I struggled. And so the nice thing about working at James Madison University is we had a fantastic library system. And so I went to my librarians and talked to them first. Libraries are big data repositories that have to be organized, they have to be accessible, and they have to be available to a broad audience. And so today, librarians are are gatekeepers in how we can understand data. And I worked with 2 librarians, one who was a data services coordinator on campus, but also our science and math librarian. And I had them look at how I was generating my data and using my data and storing it, but also had them work with me to teach me the things I didn't necessarily think about, like machine readable file names and other types of content or ways to make my data available that I hadn't considered coming out of my postdoc. And so this has improved the way that I've handled my research data, but also the way that I teach. So let's talk a little bit more about how I approach things. So I work at a primarily undergraduate university. So not only do I run a research lab of undergraduates, I also am teaching somewhere between 2 and 4 classes every semester. I believe that you learn science by doing, and so I tried to apply a lot of the research projects that I was doing and tried to have them occur in my lecture and in my instructional lab. So I'm doing research with all of these undergraduates all at once. And so I have lots and lots of collaborators who are in various states of understanding what goes on in these projects, but also I have a lot of turnover. Every semester, I get a new group of students, and in my research lab even, students sometimes stick around for as short as 4 weeks and for as long as 4 years. So I have to be able to manage a lot of these different groups to make it happen. And what I wanted to do in my ideal sense was connect all of these groups together so that I was always working on my research and having ways to connect my lecture and my labs and my research lab together and make progress in a way such that what happened in the lecture fed into the instructional labs and then my research lab, and what we learned in those lab settings could feed into my lecture-based projects. So I had a challenge of trying to find a system and a management plan that would handle all of these diverse needs. So on the next slide, I really had thought about what my system should be. I'm working with undergraduates and they don't have a lot of experience. So I need something that's easy to use. I need something that's durable because there's going to be a lot of discontinuity in my projects. I have students coming in and out. I need something that's flexible for a lot of different styles of projects. One example of the project is shown on the right on the next slide. And that is how I set up my lecture projects. There are in-class activities, there are literature projects, there are research projects. We have wikis and guidelines for how to use the system. We have a reference library. But that's not the way I set up my research lab projects or my instructional lab projects. So I need something that can fit and it can adapt a lot of different ways. And really, I needed something that was more than just an electronic notebook. I need something that can handle diverse data and be flexible in a lot of different ways. I considered a lot of different systems when I was setting this up. Evernote was very popular when I first started out as a professor, and it still is. And it was good for sharing, but it wasn't free and had some issues with flexibility that I couldn't get around. Microsoft OneNote worked well and would have worked for me, but we had some issues with the way the server was set up here on campus. So it would have worked, but I had about 10% of the students who could never get access to the project, and that was an issue in terms of accessibility for me. However, I have many colleagues on campus who use this as their electronic notebook. So OneNote works really well for storing data and managing these projects for a lot of faculty members that I know. On campus in my department, we use something called Lab Archives, which is an electronic notebook system. It also can do some data storage. We use it in the general chemistry labs that we teach, which we've got somewhere between 500 and 600 students on the project at one time. That works well for that system, but we've only recently introduced it. And so by the time this was coming into the department, I had already got my system on the Open Science Framework, or OSF, set up. And the reason I chose OSF was for its ability to go in a lot of different directions. So on the next slide, I really described those different features that I liked. One was it had a good notebooking type of feature, which is what they call the wiki in OSF. It's easy to communicate. You can put images in it. You can embed video. You can put a lot of good features into this wiki. It's good for organization in that you can use it as a notebook, but also I can make templates that I distribute to the students to give them some structure as they're learning how to do this. Storage-wise, unlimited free storage in Open Science Framework. So I didn't have to pay to make this happen. It was unlimited, it was free, it's open to a lot of different data types. So it was flexible in that regard as well. I can collaborate really easily. I can send my colleagues a link and they can go through it and get access to my project, but also they can edit and I can keep track of what they're doing through versioning. But if I have a colleague who doesn't want to use it, we can hook it into Dropbox or Drive or GitHub or some of the other popular features. And finally, dissemination. If a reviewer asks me for the raw data, I can in one link send them that data and they can take a look at it and see what I have there, and it's still kept private. But also I can make the whole project public so they can see what it looks like. And this works well with students as well, because in class, they can take their class project and make it public so that future employers or admissions committees or others who they want to show what they've done in class in terms of their research projects can see it. And it makes a good way to help my students stand out as they're going forward. So now with Open Science Framework, I can use this as my hub around how I build this massive project of undergraduates and blurring the line between my teaching and my scholarship, and provide a lot of collaboration and framework for students to learn about data management, but also learn how to do some research and be involved in a research project. So how do I start setting up students to do data management? Well, the first thing I encourage everyone to do is make a deliberate effort to show students and colleagues how to do this. One framework that a colleague of mine, Barb Reisner, along with several of the JMU librarians put together was shown here in this reference, and she has a set of activities that they gave students and had them work together to design data management, how they would organize data in an effective way. The second way that I do is in many of my protocols that I provide for students, I put an option like you see here where I say, download this, upload it here, name the file like this. And so that students are seeing, I need to save this file, I need to name it this way so that it's accessible to others. And I'm using predefined rules that we've talked about in class briefly, but also I reiterate in the protocol. So they are actively doing the saving and having to think about how they're storing their data. And it seems to work pretty well for most students. Now, data management is a widely complex task to do, and so I really boil it down to the essentials with my students to try to give them a nice basis, knowing that I can't teach them everything while I'm also trying to teach them biochemistry. So we focus on file naming and making sure that the names of the files are descriptive to the contents, they're dated in some way, and that they're hopefully machine readable. We also focus on storing the data in an organized way and try to separate raw data from the analysis, so that if you have a spreadsheet of your data, you create a second version of that spreadsheet, which you do the analysis in, so you protect your raw data. And we try to keep things in compatible formats. And finally, tidy tables. We try to keep variables and observations clear and well labeled so that you can look at a specific point in that table and know exactly what it means. An area I still struggling with is data dictionaries and README files, and trying to create a second file that gives an overarching view of what's in the folder. But it's progress. And so this is where I am at this point in this project. And the one way that I found that helps in both the classroom and in the research lab is to incentivize the data management. In the class projects, both in lab and in the lecture, I make data management part of the project such that it counts towards the final grade to a certain degree. And also I try to provide feedback on what they're doing. So if they do something well, I notice it and mention it. If they're not doing something correctly, well, we try to fix it early on, because as they get into more and more projects and these projects increase in complexity, data management becomes a more significant role in that final grade. In the research lab, these students are pretty well motivated to move forward. And we talk a lot about how, regardless of the career that you do, whether you're doing science communication, science outreach, whether you're a science writer, whether you're in the lab, a professor, or you're working for industry, all careers have data that they use and they produce, and you have to organize it somewhat. So regardless of your eventual outcome, You need to be able to understand data and to put it together, because this leads to things, at least from the academic science standpoint, of publicly available data sets, giving posters and presentations and publications. And so this type of incentivization really gives a little bit of motivation for students, so eventually they become self-motivating in wanting to do these things. And it's been fairly successful. I'm highlighting 2 projects here that we've published in the last couple of years that came out of a lot of this classroom collaborative work, where we took an idea from the class and these students crowdsourced these ideas, and in the end, we were able to combine a lot of these data sets together and build on it to move forward towards publication. And it was really a fun set of projects to do with these students. So that's not to say that everything's been easy. I've been doing this project for nearly 6 years now, and it's been a lot of bumps along the road. And some of them are just the way the culture is in terms of saving things. Google Docs and Microsoft Office 365 and all of that, these cloud-based systems are great because they automatically save things and they put them in places and they've got version control, but you don't have to think about it. And by taking that deliberate act out, you take out some of the management abilities of what you're trying to do. The other thing is that I'm dealing with students who don't deal with a lot of publicly accessible data sets. So they don't think about using others' data and making it accessible. And so this has been something to struggle with, is that, well, telling the students, well, yes, you understand the data, but others don't. So we have to find a way to bring that perspective into the classroom. And so one thing I've been doing, and I've gotten a couple of grants for, is to try to use these data sets in the classrooms more so that students are wading through publicly accessible data sets like the Protein Data Bank, those that are available in OSF or Ensemble, to try to see how they're organized and get more experience in this way. Also, most of the lab courses that are being taught at JMU, you have a cookbook type of experiment where you do this thing, you get one output, and then you get one piece of data. But we know that projects are more complex than that. And so getting the students to move beyond that, I do this, I get this one thing, can be difficult. And finally, about balance. What do I want to stress versus what do I want to not just encourage but don't force? But also, I'm teaching a biochemistry 1 class. And so I have to, in the course of teaching metabolism and enzyme kinetics, also work in these ideas, and I'd have to find that right balance. And that was a struggle for a while. In the research lab, it was also, how hard do I want to dive into these ideas? You know, I've chosen a couple things to focus on. There are others that I'm not doing or not stressing quite as much, simply because I have to realize that this is very early on in a lot of these scientists' careers. And getting them into the system and getting them to start learning these ideas is good, and we start fostering those ideas so that when they move on to graduate school or they get out into the workforce doing whatever they're going to do, they are better for it, and they've got these ideas, and they can continue to start growing in their abilities to manage data and handle them. So thinking about managing data and building the culture, what I recommend is that you make a plan as a group. Whoever that group might be, whether it's your collaborators, the others in your lab. That way you get buy-in from all parties. I often find talking to students, they bring in perspectives about the way we do things that I wouldn't have considered, and they can sometimes suggest good ways that actually complement and improve what I was thinking. So get buy-in from lots of perspectives, and that can help you. Look at the norms in your field, if there are any. In structural biology, which is one field that I interact with a lot, it is the norm to take your data from crystallography experiments or small angle experiments and deposit them in known repositories. That is what we do. But there may not be norms in your field. And so that is something to think about and to maybe talk to others in your field about. And then how you can foster data reevaluation by others to increase reproducibility, data sharing and being open. And also look at your funding agencies and your institutions. What do they require? Finally, what infrastructure, or in the middle here, what infrastructure do you need? I laid out some of the infrastructure ideas that I needed early on, but you may have different needs depending on what you work on. You may have more security needs that you have, or you may need larger bandwidth. And you can reevaluate your plan as needed. I do it every semester or so, or when we start moving in a new direction, starting a new project. And finally, talk to your librarians. It was really helpful for me. And so I'm always thinking, what would a librarian do as I'm working through my data management plan? So in closing, this doesn't happen without the students. So I thank the students in my classes that I teach and the teaching assistants that I have, lots of collaborators and funding organizations as well that have supported the development of the science work. And I've got a link there, as well as email and other ways to communicate with me if you have questions or want to discuss how I got to the point where I am today. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Chris. You've given us a lot of reasons why you might want to evaluate your data, which leads us into poll number 3. So what has motivated you to look back at older data? And again, you can pick as many answers as you want for this. Okay, so it looks like there are a lot of different reasons why you all might want to look back at your data. And now Chris Ulens is going to give us a few more. So on to you, Chris.
Hi, Catherine, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to present at this webinar. My presentation is going to be complementary because I'm going to talk about long-term storage of large data sets. Now, my laboratory is interested in the biology of ion channels. We actually use a wide range of different techniques, but 2 of them include structural methods, namely X-ray crystallography and cryo-electron microscopy to pursue channel structures at atomic resolution. And these are also the two main methods in our lab that typically produce large volumes of data, up to several terabytes on a monthly basis. Now, your own lab may be using different methods, but also methods that typically produce such large volumes of data. Now, in this typical workflow in X-ray crystallography, we start by producing purified protein at relatively large amounts, sometimes up to 1 milligram. We then perform crystallization screening to grow crystals, and we take these crystals physically to a synchrotron radiation source, where we shine a beam of X-ray light onto the crystal. If the crystal is of good quality, it will diffract the X-rays, producing dark spots in a diffraction image. We collect thousands of these images for a complete data set, which we then use to calculate the electron density map, build the 3D structure of the protein. And so the thousands of diffraction images is what produces the large volume of data in this type of experiment. The workflow in cryo-EM is somewhat similar, except that we don't grow crystals, but we need to prepare protein samples on a grid. These grids are then used to collect micrographs from which we reconstruct single particles. And so similar to the diffraction images, it's the micrographs, so the gray data in the middle that take up large volumes. And in cryo-EM, these data sets are even up to an order of magnitude bigger than the X-ray data sets. So in short, the large volume of data that we generate in structural biology come from the gray images in the middle, and they can be in a range of several terabytes on a monthly basis. And I will now give you my perspective on how we handle and manage these data. So on the top left, you see an aerial shot of what a synchrotron radiation source looks like. So we travel to one of those sources, and we have several in Europe, and there are several sources throughout the world. And we roughly travel to these synchrotrons on a monthly basis. We usually get access to beam lines in blocks of 24 hours. So that means that we're collecting 24 hours nonstop of data. So we usually end up with terabytes of data to go home. Now we locally process and copy all of these data on a USB disk. I have an example here of the Lacy disk, which has a robust design and that makes it convenient for traveling. The capacity of that type of disk goes up to 4 terabytes, and if you buy the USB-C Thunderbolt version, which is the most recent standard, you have a high bandwidth that goes up to 4 gigabit per second, and that allows us to copy the data in a very fast way. After the beam time finishes, we travel back home with the disk, and once we get back in the lab, the first thing that we typically do is to compress the data, because compression in our case actually reduces the data volume to less than half. So it pays off to do this first before anything and before copying your data to other media. So after compression, we copy a second copy of the data onto a large volume storage network drive that is offered by our IT department. So that generates a second copy. At the end of each calendar year, we also make a third copy of all the data from that year combined onto a single disk. And for that purpose, the internal SATA disk is attractive because the capacity of those disks goes up to 16 terabytes. The bandwidth is a bit lower than the USB disks. It's at about 6 gigabit per second, but it is very convenient to have all of your data from 1 year on one disk. And by the way, you can very easily connect those SATA disks onto your computer via a USB port if you use a docking station. And then from there, the SATA disk goes into a fireproof safe in my office. Finally, for data older than 10 years, we archive our data on magnetic tape. So in summary, if you follow the workflow, we have 3 different copies of all of these data. One is on a USB disk, the second one is on a network drive, and a third one is on an SATA disk, each in 3 separate locations. Now on the next slide, I'm giving you an example of what my screen looks like if I'm trying to access old data through our large volume network drive. So I can see all my data on a simple, in a simple window, and I've indicated with the red arrows how the tree of data unfolds. So if you look at A, I've unfolded the folder for 2013, which was the year where I'm trying to retrieve the data. B shows the actual date of the synchrotron experiment. So in this case, it was at the ESRF, which is the synchrotron in Grenoble. Then C is the name of the beamline. D is the secret acronym we have for the protein we work on. E is the folder that contains the process data. And then in the window on the right, you see F, the actual crystal that we used in that experiment. And G and H are the crystallization plate number and the well location in a 96 well plate. So using this type of data organization, I can always very quickly trace back data even from several years ago, and we can actually link those data to the single crystal, the single protein prep, and even the exact chemical conditions that were used to grow the protein crystals. Now on the next slide, I'm trying to address the question, why is it important to store your data long-term? These are probably answers mostly relevant to structural biology and X-ray crystallography, but you may have similar answers in your field. Now in X-ray crystallography, there were new criteria set for determining the high resolution cutoff of the data, basically a marker for the quality of your data. And this was a science paper published by Karplus and Diederich. So that meant you could get better data, at least if you were still able to find the raw data. The second point is X-ray crystallography and structural biology is a field that it is still moving and developing very fast. So the development of new software methods allowed us in the past to solve structures that were intractable with the older methods. And a very great example was the development of Phaser by Randy Reed that allowed people to solve structures that were unsolvable before. So you could actually get new data if you were at least able to find the old data you thought that were useless. In our field, software developers are also actively requesting the community to share difficult test data sets, so you can actually help method developers tackle your most difficult projects. And the list goes on the next slide. So you're likely able to support your data should any critical questions arise. And unfortunately, in the structural biology field, we've had a couple of retractions of high-profile structural studies, and these were commented on in the Science and Nature papers that I cite here. So you want to avoid retraction of your papers, but let's not go there. Your funding agency will also ask you to store your data at least 5 years beyond the end of your project, so you will have to implement and data management plans are an integral part of your research proposal these days. Some journals are also asking to deposit large data sets in repositories associated with your publication, and some of those papers or the journals even cover the costs of deposition. So 2 of the upcoming players have been websites or servers like Dryad or Zenodo, which allow you to deposit your data in parallel with a publication. On to the next slide. Disasters happen, and they've happened in our lab as well. I think it's important to keep in mind that any media can fail. So even your USB disks, even an internal hard drive, and certainly CDs and DVDs are very prone to failing. So I think it pays off in the long term to keep at least 2 copies of your data in 2 separate locations. If disaster happens, it's best not to panic, because in a state of panic, you're likely to do more damage. So if you're overwhelmed by emotions, it's probably better to let your IT experts take over. There are also data recovery service companies, so companies that can do magic with failing disks, but this kind of service comes at a price. So there are a couple of example companies in Europe where they charge $200 just for diagnosis and up to $3,000 and more for the actual recovery of your data. So now data management plans are the new norm. They are an integral part of your research plan. So your IT expenses can also be an integral part of your research costs. If you look at how we manage our large data flow and the disks that I've mentioned, then the price of let's say a 5 terabyte latest generation USB-C Thunderbolt disk would come around $150. If you look at the largest capacity internal SATA disk, then that's a bit more expensive. It's at around $600 on Amazon. The docking station is very cheap. It costs around $25. At my university, the IT people ask, they have 10 gigabyte storage, which is free of charge. If you want large volume network access like we do, it'll cost $600 per 5 terabyte per year. And we also use Box Enterprise to quickly share smaller chunks of data through cloud, and that costs us around $10 per 100 gigabyte per year. So if you add all that up, I think $2,000 per year on budget costs is a fair number. And that of course excludes any of your costs on software licenses or journal subscriptions. I also want to add a few words of caution on how you choose your backup media and how to use data formats. I think you need to be cautious with CDs and DVD ROMs and even the USB 3 disks and sticks. They came very cheap. They still come cheap, but you can ask yourself how many of your 10-year-old disks have a scratch and are now unreadable. Apple has already been phasing out CD and DVD readers and even USB 3 ports from its MacBooks. So you might want to think if those media will still be readable 10 years from now. The cloud solutions are currently very popular, but you need to think about security. Now, your institution might offer the business version of cloud solutions like Box, Dropbox, or Google Drive, which will give you more versatility and also leverage in case something goes wrong. What about data format? And the question is, will your data still be readable after a couple of software upgrades? So I think you need to double check the installation instructions before you upgrade any software. And it's good practice to keep your installation files for that software for the older versions in case you would need them later. The question is, should I compress data? So I think I mentioned in our case, we can compress data and reduce the volume by about half the size. So I think you should look into compression, and a tractable format is the zip format, which has been around for a long time, and it looks like it might stay around. Just to finish off a couple of recent developments in the EU and in the US, and new depositories that structural biologists have initiated. The structural biology community is usually very resourceful and very collaborative. So in the recent COVID-19 crisis, there have been initiatives by Randy Reed, for example, at the University of Cambridge, to share all the raw images for the structures that have been obtained for this virus. There's also been the initiative by Frank van Delft at the Diamond Light Source in the UK, where they did a fragment screen, which was a massive effort to collect X-ray data sets for the SARS-CoV-2 main protease bound to a library of at least 1,000 compounds. So all of those data are currently shared on the website that I mentioned, and it's a call to all the drug designers out there to use the structural data and do structure-based drug design. Now, prior to the COVID-19 crisis, there were already initiatives by the structural biologists in the US, in the UK, and in Europe to put up depositories to share the raw data images. And I'm mentioning a couple of here, the structural biology data grid. The protein data bank now also allows you to deposit raw data, and they will give you a DOI to accompany with your paper. ResearchGate also offers deposition of your raw data. And in the cryo-EM field, things are also moving fast, and archives are being made available to deposit the raw data. Just a final slide to give you some ideas to think through. So I think what I want to show is that spending a little bit of time every month on your data management will save you days or even weeks of work later should you need those data. Think about how to use your backup media efficiently. The cloud solutions are currently great, and they're very useful to quickly share small chunks of data with your coworkers, but it's probably not a good medium to share large data sets in the long term. Vice versa, backup media like tape can be efficient to archive large data sets, but keep in mind that it also takes a long time, several hours, before you can retrieve them later. And the final note is, assume that all your data can be useful, and even the ones from failed experiments could have a purpose later. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. So while we gather our thoughts about all the different ways that you can store your data and reuse it later, we're gonna think right now about, in our poll, about what resources have you attendees found useful in creating a data management plan so far. So this is again a multiple choice, feel free to answer as many as are relevant. For those of you who have not created a data management plan yet, feel free to imagine what you would have done or skip the question as you like. Oh, and here come the results. Wow, so you guys have already tapped into a lot of different resources that are available. And we've already heard from Chris Berndsen about the power of librarians And now we're going to hear more directly from Jenny, our representative librarian, to give her institutional and library perspective.
Hi, folks, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar. Yeah, I'm a librarian. I'm at the University of California, San Diego, and I think the reason that I'm here is that if we go on to the next slide, to talk about the library and institutional perspective, why libraries are involved in this space. I'll talk very briefly about the services that my library provides as examples, some of the related services, and then if your institution is organized a little differently, some of these same services may be available through other places in your organization, some of the challenges, and the Chris's have already talked about some of these things. And then, of course, because I'm a librarian, there's a list of links and readings. So this is the next, this is where we would have been. This is not our data repository. This is the San Diego Convention Center, which is where the convention would have been held. And so you can all imagine yourself wandering around going to get fish tacos after this is over. On to the next one. So why are libraries even in this space? As Chris Berndsen mentioned, we've always been the place that collects, describes, and preserves information. And for the last 300 years in the sciences, that's been journals and articles. We've also had a long role in teaching information literacy, literature searching, citation management, things like that. And when we first started to see funders in the US and Europe mandate open access to articles, libraries jumped in. We were facing spiraling journal costs, and we got super on board with the taxpayer kind of revolts to have access, free access to the science that they were funding. And so initially that was focused on articles and pre and post prints. Libraries got on board with lobbying our universities to have faculty open access mandates, but obviously articles are no longer the endpoint. So libraries started to get on board with research data in the late 2000s, and as the mandates for data management plans have expanded to shareable data, libraries have served as a good neutral institutional home for this type of resource. We have a lot of expertise with metadata and with storage, and we often partner with research IT or central IT on our campuses to do this work. There's an association of research libraries, which is libraries at large research institutions in the US, and they have been tracking libraries' participation, and as of a report they issued this January, all ARL libraries have some type of capability in data management. So if we go on to the next slide, these are the services that we offer at my library. We have a program called Research Data Curation that is focused on these things for across the campus. So they work with archaeologists and political scientists and people in all disciplines, and then in partnership with the subject librarian for that area, which is me in biology. So we consult with researchers on their data management plans, getting IDs for themselves and their objects. Data management plans have kind of, I wouldn't say fallen away, but they're no longer the primary thing that we work on, as the DMP tool seems to take care of what most folks need in terms of writing their grants and having that plan available for their funders. That helps you write data management plans for a variety of funders and tracks, gives you kind of a nice checklist of all the things you need to put in place. In terms of helping folks with mandates, it's actually now publisher mandates that are driving most of our business. They're ready to push that publish button and, oh, look at all these things I need to have, like things that JVC will come and ask you about later. We also do training. We have certified instructors in the software carpentry organization who teach workshops on R and other tools for processing data. This past year, they held 8 different sets of those workshops, plus some sessions for summer programs. We do run a local repository that houses data sets as well as more traditional library archival material all together in the same bucket. We actually don't host locally that many data sets in biology, but we certainly offer that as an opportunity. I think a lot of folks prefer to use more of a discipline-based repository, such as some of the ones that have been mentioned before, and we're certainly not in the business of telling researchers what to do. Libraries can also serve as the home for some of those license tools. I think at some universities, the library is involved in licensing lab notebooks, not in our case. We do sponsor Protocols.io, but not lab notebooks. But these are all going to vary university to university. We go on to the next slide. Some of the other things that are kind of related to these that libraries also provide that you might want to think about, including broader scholarly communications work. We work with students to help them, get on board as scholars, establish records. We offer a research prize in the undergraduate research program. And many libraries also have a repository for the more article type content, going back to the initial open access publishing mandates that can be separate from a data set repository. So if you see that your institution offers something called an institutional repository, that may or may not handle data. But in our case, our article repository is one that's shared by all 10 of the UC campuses. So we do host, dissertations, open access, technical reports and stuff like that, but that's not data. And I think we can go on. The next 3 slides are just real fast screenshots. This is our research data curation program page on our website. Your library probably has a page like this somewhere. The next page is just the landing page of our digital collections repository, where you can either search or start down the road of either the archival collections or research data sets. The next slide is just an object page for a data set that's open and downloadable. It's not that pretty, but there is some metadata that's shown as well as in the README file. And the last screenshot is a horrible looking slide of just a listing from our GitHub repository on the materials for the data workshops that we've done over the last few years. So some of them are discipline oriented, some of them are not, some of them are real general. We do mostly R. We have some instructors that do Python, but most of our in-house expertise is on R. So if your library doesn't work in this, if you want to move on, some places that you might want to talk to would be your contracts and grants office that would definitely have more expertise with the funders. Maybe these functions are done at a research IT group within your institution. Your intellectual property office may be able to offer advice around ownership, especially if your research is likely to lead to something that you want to commercialize. Libraries tend to not get involved with anything clinical. That would be probably different at a medical school that was doing this kind of research, but in our case, certainly anything where you're approaching us with patient data, we're like, la, 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 go talk to somebody else. I mean, we can refer you to the right people, but our repository is not set up for that. Your vendors of both your equipment that generates data and the eLab notebooks that you have. And all 3 of the people in our research data program that I talked to about this for this talk said, well, and in reality, you're just going to do what your PI does. So definitely talk to your local colleagues about practices, and especially that interim storage where it's not long-term preservation, it's the operational, you're working with these data right now. What is your local storage situation? If you move on to the next slide, some of these are going to be familiar. Some of the challenges that we're seeing that we're sort of struggling with, we are not the fastest developers on the planet. So some of these new expectations around reproducibility, where you want to have a package that includes your raw data, the code that was used to process it, visualizations into some kind of container that's described, sort of what Chris Berndsen was talking about with the data dictionaries. This is just hard, and I think we're all trying to work towards hoping a standard will develop that sort of enables an easy way to package these things up. Multi-institutional collaborations are hard for our local institutions. It's very important to understand the terms of agreement that your institution provides. Institutional systems often piggyback on campus identity systems for access, and so it can be hard, especially for large collaborations, to interact with data that's stored in our local systems. So that's why some of these cloud services and larger institutional discipline-based repositories are more useful for people. Also, the training that we offer is kind of 101 level. So we folks that go through our workshops that say, okay, what do I do now? And we're not experts in your particular data. So our services kind of have a point. And finally, that findability for the librarians is still not optimal. There's no sort of Google Scholar for data, although Google is actually working on a data set search tool. There isn't one perfect one-stop shop to find data sets that you might want to work or investigate. And that's the end of my content. The next slide is just a link to a page that I have set up in Google Docs with links to further readings, further training materials that we've gathered that we refer folks to, and an acknowledgement of my colleagues. And with that, I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
To questions, I think.
Yeah, thanks so much. We have one more slide, which is further additional resources beyond what Jenny had just talked to you about. And I wanted to point out one particular thing, which is the data management activity that Chris Berndsen actually made just for you guys. So he's created some activities for you to help think about your project and strategies. And he has provided an answer key, but don't peek, in part because you need to do the exercise, but in part because the goal is to think about how you want to design your plan, so knowing his answers may not help you anyway. I'll also mention that the slides from this webinar are going to be deposited in an online database, and the video of the webinar will be loaded into YouTube, and we're going to send you an email with both of those links, so you don't need to furiously scrabble down all these links. So that'll be coming soon. Now it is 101, but we are going to try and sneak in one question, which I think kind of captures a lot of the next steps, and we can all turn on our videos. So hello, everyone. So the question is inspired by a question from one of our attendees, Shreya Mandal. What would you say is step number one? You've come away inspired from this webinar. You're dedicated to having a data management plan. Where do you begin? Do you talk to your lab mates? Do you think about your own projects? Are you, as the lab head, putting down a mandate from the top? What's step one? Maybe Chris or Chris, would you want to dive into what step one was for your project? Where you really, what was the most fundamental thing?
I think looking into the latest technology and buying a disk, seeing what kind of capacity we had, and then just serve the Amazon site to get good value for our money.
Okay. What about you, Chris? You talked a lot about where things began for you, but maybe what was the very first step you took?
The very first step after talking to my librarians was really moving towards figuring out the infrastructure, much like what Chris says. And he was buying it. In my case, I was thinking about how can I do this on something where there's no funding effectively. And then once I had that infrastructure laid out, push the start button and hope it works.
Sounds good. Okay, a related question. What if someone is not following the plan? I mean, again, Chris, as the lab head, you have a lot of authority to say, follow the plan, but how do you inspire people to take action with you? And how do you make time to make it happen on a day-to-day or month-to-month basis?
Well, I think it changed in recent years now that data management plans are an integral part of a research proposal. So I often use the argument to say to people, look, the people that actually pay for your salary, the people who pay for your experiments, actually ask that we do this small thing. So it's a small thing that we can do in return for something that we need to do anyway. And I think that argument is usually very convincing if people understand that it's something beyond the level of the lab, but it's an institutional or governmental decision, then most people understand that it is important.
I haven't had many students who don't buy into it, either because they know that I've got a grade I'm holding over them, or because I think the undergraduates that I work with really are motivated to move to the next step. And that's really the great part, is realizing that managing your data well gets you to that next step a lot easier.
Super. And I'm going to sneak in one final question because we're now 5 minutes over. Thinking about being a reader of the literature, both literature that's come out of your own lab in the past and other labs, how do you apply these same kind of strategies to thinking about whether someone else's data is robust and whether you want to follow up on it in your own lab?
I'm going to let the other Chris go first.
Sort of taking the same strategy myself. So it's when looking at others' data and managing, I hope that everyone is as active and deliberate in what I'm trying to do. And I do try to go see others' data when I'm reviewing papers and it's a crystallography paper. I ask to see the coordinates and look at the data. So if I don't see the data behind it and I really have questions, I ask and try to get those data sets. And if I can't see the data, I try not to think badly about that scientist or the science that they're doing, but I do have some issues in not being able to see the raw data.
I think JBC has been taking a good initiative in recent years on the policy of Western blots, because you've given a couple of very good examples on how excessive cropping of data or overexposure can actually lead to maybe an interpretation that is not fully supported by the data. So having access to the raw scan and the full blot is really a valuable thing in the robustness of the papers that we publish.
Thanks for that. It's all basically due to Kaoru, who's been championing this all along. Jenny, I've seen you nodding your head a lot during this question.
Yep, sounds
okay.
Good.
Okay. Okay. Well, in the interest of time, as we are now 7 minutes over, I'm going to go ahead and close the webinar. So I will just say thank you so much to everyone for coming. We've reached the end of our time, obviously. We hope you found it useful. We also hope you'll take the time to fill out a short survey about the webinar. It will be available when you leave the meeting and through an email you'll receive at the conclusion of the webinar. So thanks so much to all of our panelists for all the time they've invested. Thanks to our attendees for coming, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.